Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CILTNA webinar on understanding the key issues in the Canadian steel industry. With us today, we have François Desmarais. He's the Vice President, Trade and Industry Affairs at the Canadian Steel Producers Association. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Joy Nott, and I'm a partner for Trade and Customs at KPMG in Canada. So we're going to get started today. So I will start sharing my screen. Oops, give me a second here. There, hopefully everyone can see my screen. So before we get started today, I just wanted to talk a little bit about CILTNA for those who may not be familiar with CILTNA. CILT, the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, was actually founded in 1919 and was given a royal charter in 1926. And it's got some really large companies and transportation companies and heads of government agencies and stuff as members. CILTNA, the North American division of CILT, was founded in 1985, and it's headquartered in Ottawa, but it's got chapters in Vancouver, Toronto, Ottawa, and in Georgia in the United States. And I believe there might be another new chapter in the United States aside from Georgia. So if you have any questions about CILTNA or are interested in joining, there's a QR code here that you can scan for more information, or don't hesitate to reach out to me or info@ciltna.ca or .com. .com. Thank you. So today, I'm going to present a few slides talking about the steel situation, the tariffs and steels in Canada. And then after that, we're going to have a conversation with François about the Canadian industry and what he's seeing and the forces that are at play here. So with that, the current state of tariffs in Canada. So this is not just steel and aluminum, it's the electric vehicles, it's the vehicles themselves, and it's the list on the far right known as List 1, which is everything from Florida oranges to Tennessee whiskey and that sort of thing. So focusing on the steel and aluminum at this point in time, Canada has surtaxes, which is the Canadian word for tariffs, that are applied to Chinese steel, US steel, and steel from other countries around the world. And we're going to get into a little bit of detail on that moving forward. The steel rate in Canada is either 25 or 50%, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But what I want to draw your attention to is at the bottom of the screen, there is the Canadian government gave a 6-month temporary relief to the surtaxes if you're importing steel or aluminum and you're using it to manufacture or process any good. So it's not just the food and the beverage packaging. If you brought in steel or aluminum and paid Canadian surtaxes and you use that steel and aluminum in a manufacturing process or a process overall, you can get your money back. Now, there's a 2-year window to get the money back. The remission is in place now until June 30th. There was one that expired at the end of January of this year. There's another remission that's in place for June 30th in specific circumstances. But the takeaway here is that if you've paid surtax on steel and aluminum and you used it in manufacturing in Canada, you can get your money back. And if you've got any questions on that, reach out to me after the fact. So now let's take a look at the steel and aluminum tariffs out of the United States. There's 4 basic things to think about here. Starting at the left, it became effective on March 13th, 2025, and the rate is 25%. It applies to all goods, commercial and casual, and it's calculated on the customs value of the imported goods. There's a bunch of times when it does not apply. So if the goods are classified in Chapter 98, which is non-commercial provisions, or Chapter 99 of the tariffs, those are commercial provisions. But keep in mind, there are exceptions to that. Not everything in 98 and 99 is applicable here. If you had goods that were previously imported in Canada and paid duty, and the big one that I get asked a lot of questions on is goods that are made in the United States but go back and forth across the border to be altered or repaired for some reason, they can go back and forth across. The Canadian surtax will not apply in that circumstance. Then there's a few sort of one-off issues or exceptions, I should say, not issues, Port Campobello Island and Akwesasne Reserve. So when you're talking about the US steel and aluminum, what kind of proof of origin do you need when you're talking about bringing steel and aluminum to the border and declaring that it's US in content? You need a commercial invoice or any other document that contains the required data elements that customs requires. And those goods need to be eligible to be marked in accordance with the rules of marking rules of origin for CUSMA countries. So I'll be talking more about proof of origin and what you need moving forward, but keep that in mind. For US steel, you need to be able to prove that it should be marked country of origin under the CUSMA marking regulations. It doesn't actually mean that the steel needs to be marked. It means it needs to meet those rules. And then finally, duty drawback and other duty relief programs are still applicable. If you can meet the conditions of those programs are still applicable here. Then right at the very bottom, the United States is defined, and it does not include Puerto Rico, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, American Samoa, or the US Virgin Islands. So the United States and what is considered the United States is a defined term. Now, I'm not going to go through this slide in any kind of detail. You will get copies of these slides following the webinar today. They will be sent to you in PDF form. I want to draw your attention to the navy blue box on the right side of this slide. So on July 31st, 2025, Chinese steel, melted and poured, or aluminum, smelt and cast, coming into Canada, started attracting a 25% tariff. In September of 2025 forward, Canada Customs started requiring specific kinds of documentation to prove where the metal went from liquid to solid form. So in other words, you need to be able to present to Canada Customs a certificate or report, and there's a list there on the right, a mill certificate, a certificate of conformance, a metallurgical test, chemical analysis certificate. You need to be able to prove where that metal went from liquid to solid. If you cannot prove it, where that happened, it will be assumed by the Canadian Customs authorities that the steel is Chinese, and the surtaxes will apply. So then, late last year, in November, the Prime Minister announced some new trade measures to protect the steel industry. So there was reduced tariff rate quotas, and I'll talk to that in a second. And there's a new 25% tariff on various steel derivatives. I'm going to talk to that on the next slide. So if you look at the right-hand side of this slide, Canada is now treating countries where we have a free trade agreement differently than countries where we do not have a free trade agreement. So if we have a free trade agreement, and I'm talking about all free trade agreements except CUSMA. Okay, so put CUSMA to the side. So for example, we have free trade agreements with Korea, Europe, Japan. There's a number of free trade agreements that we have as a country. When you're talking any of those countries, what's going to be used is the 2024 import level. That's going to be the baseline. And once 75% of that baseline, the 2024 import quantity, has been reached, any steel that comes in from those countries over and above that amount is going to be tariffed at a 50% rate. For countries where we don't have a free trade agreement, everything that I just said, the 2024 will be the baseline. Once 20% of steel from those countries comes in, anything after that will be charged at a 50% tariff. Now, going on the left-hand side, there are some remissions that are available, and you can read those when I send the slides out, but there's in certain cases, if the goods are being used, if the steel is being used in motor vehicles and aerospace, if aluminum is being used to package food, or if goods are coming in for public safety, healthcare, national security purposes, there are potential ways that you can avoid paying the surtax, and if you've paid it, you can get a refund back. Keeping in mind you've got that 2-year window open. I mentioned earlier that on December 26th, so Merry Christmas, there was a new surtax that was introduced on steel derivatives. And While it says steel derivatives, if you look at the blue box, the light blue box in the center of the slide, there are 61 tariff classifications that are caught by this new surtax order. 46 of them are your stereotypical steel and articles of steel. But then if you look, there's also one tariff classification there for plastic, another for base metals, aluminum wire, and furniture and prefab buildings. So it's important to understand when any of these orders come out, what I generally do is I turn to the annex or I look to the list of tariff classifications that are covered to see, and it's a best practice for you to check that to see if any of your tariff classifications that you use to import are caught by any of these surtax orders or the reverse, the remission order. Yeah, so I'll leave it there. It's important to understand, going on the far right-hand side of the screen, Canada has a non-stacking policy. So I'm sure many of you probably remember that early on in the United States, as the various tariffs were being issued last year, what was happening is they were stacking on top of each other. They corrected that at the end of April, and for the most part now, tariffs do not stack anymore in the United States. There's an exception to that for China. But in Canada, there is no stacking. There's a non-stacking policy, which means if you bring something in, steel and aluminum in, and it's possibly that it qualifies for more than one surtax, there's an actual set of instructions that you're supposed to follow to determine which surtax you're supposed to use. And then on the left-hand side, the tariff will not apply for the derivatives. Again, if it's Chapter 98, if the goods were imported before July 1st, 2026 for use in a motor vehicle, parts, or full vehicles, and if it's imported before July 1st, 2026 for the use in aircraft and parts of aircraft. This is a list of remissions. What a remission is literally relief to the surtax. So up to now, I've been talking about which surtaxes get charged. This is a list of surtax remissions. These are circumstances when you can get surtaxes relieved. And if you paid the surtaxes at the border, this is where you can use these remission orders to apply for a refund. So starting on the left-hand side, the Chinese surtax, there is a remission. In order to get the relief, your goods need to be listed on the schedule that's attached to the order in council. There's a long list of tariff classifications. And I'm not going to go through each one of these bullet points. And as I've stated earlier, you have 2 years from the date of import to apply for a refund. If when you review that particular remission order, you recognize the fact that you qualify for it, you've got 2 years to go back and get your money back. I'm going to skip the vehicles because that's not today's conversation. The U.S. goods list and the steel and aluminum, the U.S. steel and aluminum. There was, in April, the Canadian government put a 6-month remission order in place, and then they extended it beyond the 6 months. So if you imported any good for processing in Canada, that includes the automotive and aerospace industry, if you imported things to be used in the packaging of food or a beverage, and as I stated earlier, for the purposes of any healthcare, public safety, national security, if you think that you fall into any of those categories, again, you've got 2 years from the date of import to go back and claim the money. Certain steel goods from free trade and non-free trade agreements, they has to be listed on specific, there's long lists in the remission order of tariff classifications. Your tariff classification has to be listed in the relevant schedule, and the goods need to be imported on or after June 27th, 2025. Again, that 2-year recovery. And then finally, the last one, steel derivatives from any country. Again, you can get relief if the tariff classification that you import on is listed in one of the long lists in a schedule as part of the order in council. It's to be used by specific kinds of entities, the healthcare, national security, etc. And I'm not going to get into the wind towers. There's also, if you look at the very bottom, there's also relief for goods that were in transit to Canada when the surtaxes took effect. So if you had shipments that were already on the water or were already moving towards Canada when the surtaxes came into effect, you might want to look at potentially to see if you can get your refund on that. So just before we wrap up and I get into the US stuff, if you take nothing else away from today, because I know I just went through a lot of information very quickly and I only hit the high points. I did not get into any detail. And again, as a reminder, you will get these slides. If you remember nothing else from today when it comes to Canadian steel tariffs, here's 6 of them and I'll add a 7th on when I get to the end. The new reality for steel and aluminum moving around the world is melt and pour, smelt and cast if you're talking aluminum. That now determines the country of origin. It's the country of origin where the metal turned from liquid to solid, except for the US. Remember when I said earlier, the US, you just need to declare that it's US. Anywhere else, you need that documentation that I was talking about. If you can't prove where it was made, it's going to be assumed to be Chinese, and the Chinese surtaxes will apply. Steel from China. The Canadian government is actively looking to limit the amount of Chinese steel that enters Canada from any country. That includes steel that are in finished goods, where the steel itself was melted and poured in China. They're looking as much as possible to limit the amount of that steel that enters the country. It rolls right into how we're treating free trade partners differently than we are treating non-free trade partners. I talked about the 75% and the 20% earlier. Steel derivatives list. There's a list of 61 tariff classifications. Not everything is steel. Relief is available. Canada has a non-stacking policy. And the 7th one is the duty rates in Canada are either 25% or 50%. And the 50% only applies to that free trade thing that I was talking about, the 75% for free trade partners, the 20% for non-free trade partners. Other than that, the rate is 25%. So I often get asked, because in the United States, there's rates sometimes at 15 and it's 25% in Canada. When it's not 25, it's 50. Last slide. So last week on April 2nd, I should say, there was a proclamation made by the President of the United States with respect to steel and aluminum and copper entering the United States. Getting down to the nuts and bolts of what's in that proclamation, when you read to the end of it, there are 3 annexes that are mentioned. In Annex 1 is divided into 2 sections, Annex 1A and Annex 1B. Annex 1A covers aluminum and steel and most copper. The tariff rates for anything, the tariff classifications that fall in Annex 1A are 50% tariff, 25% for the UK, and 10% for articles that are melt or cast in the United States. Annex 1B covers copper, aluminum, and steel derivatives. That's a 25% rate, so there's a difference there. That changed. A 15% rate for UK articles and 10% where the metal was entirely smelt or cast in the US. Annex 2, these are goods that have been removed from the steel and aluminum tariffs. So there's a list of tariff classifications where the steel and aluminum tariffs are no longer going to apply. I'm oversimplifying here when I say, but when I took a look at that list, there's a lot of that list that it's tariff classification of food products. So think about food products that are coming in steel cans and that sort of thing. That sort of stuff seems to have now been removed. It's not only food products, but a lot of it is food products. And then there's specific provisions for motorcycles and motorcycle parts, which I won't get into. The 3rd annex talks about derivatives are now capped at 15% until January 1st, 2028, 10% if they're entirely US origin. I'm only going to hit the high points here. There's a removal of certain derivative products from the list. So now certain derivatives going into the United States are no longer tariffable. And then dropping to the bottom of the list, Section 232 only applies where metal is greater than or equal to 15% of the weight of an article. So François and I were talking earlier about, think of a dental floss package. It's basically plastic with the dental floss inside, and then you've got that tiny little metal piece. Up to now, that tiny little metal piece fell as a derivative. Now, I'm assuming that tiny little metal piece is less than 15% of the weight of the entire article, so that would no longer be covered. And then the last thing is steel and aluminum tariffs uh, do not are exempt from the Section 122 tariffs. What are Section 122 tariffs? The 10% tariffs that the president put in place after the Supreme Court ruling where the IEEPA tariffs, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act tariffs, were deemed to be unconstitutional. So that same day that ruling came down, the president came out and put a 10% tariff across the board for all countries. Those tariffs don't apply if you have a Section 232 tariff that applies. And probably at the very bottom of the screen, for me as a customs person, probably the most important thing that came out of this, aside from the fact that now there's a de minimis for weight and things like that, is that the tariffs will now be calculated on the value of the goods and not on the weight of steel or the proportion of the product that is steel, aluminum, or copper. And if, for example, you had one item and it had steel, aluminum, and copper inside the as parts and materials for the finished item. Now you only have to pay multi-metal articles are only charged Section 232 once. So you don't pay 25% on the little bit of copper, 25% on the little bit of aluminum, and 25% on the steel. The entire value of those three metals is charged 25%. So I know I went through that really quickly, but I really wanted to get to what I think is going to be the best part of this webinar today, and that's having a conversation with François. So François, I just went through a bunch of things really fast. What are your thoughts? What are you seeing? You work for the Canadian Steel Producers Association. What's going on? What are you seeing?
Thanks, Joy, for the invitation. I appreciate being here today. I think you demonstrated well that our world changed a lot last year.
Mhm.
2025 was a complex and challenging year, I guess, not just for the steel industry in general, but for any professional in the import-export world, especially when it comes to trade policy with the US. At some point, we had changes by the hours. We had a couple tweets by the president on weekends, so we were left scrambling, trying to figure it out. And this is not over yet. We have to deal with it.
Well,
And
sorry, that's a great point because even this last proclamation came out on a Friday afternoon and it became effective Monday morning. And that's been
Easter
happening
long
a lot.
weekend.
Yeah. And it's been
Yeah,
happening.
no. So very complex, even for professional in the field like ourselves. We were left scrambling, trying to understand everything, what it mean for industry. And 2025, I don't think it comes as a surprise for anyone on the call. That was an absolute terrible year for the steel industry in Canada. We were hit hard by the U.S. tariff, the reinstatement of the Section 232 on steel. Right from the get-go in March of last year, the 25% that it was then applied to our product, we lost 15% of our volume that month, even if it was just announced mid-month. And then our shipment kept sliding down. So we were like 25% below our monthly average in April and May of 2025. But then that was not enough. In June, the president increased the 232 tariffs to 50%. And
Mm.
that really hit us even harder. Our export to the US dropped to 50% the level of the previous year on a monthly basis. And so we finished the year 2025 with a reduction of our export to the US by 40%. So basically, we're exporting, usually in a normal year, we're exporting like 6 million metric tons of steel to the US, our largest export market by far, or only export market, I would even say. So we're shipping 6 million tons in normal years, and then we dropped to 4 million tons last year. So basically, we lost about $3.5 billion Canadian dollars in unrealized sale in the US market year over year. And to put things in perspective, we were shipping 10 billion a year, and now we're down to 6.5 last year. And the US market is 50% of the Canadian production for our producers. So that hit hard. And even if that 50%, like it still impact us greatly. early months in 2026. We have data for January and February, and our export to the US is still going down. We're barely at 35% the level of normal months now going into the US. So for us, 2025 is a year we would rather forget, but unfortunately, we had to adapt. We had to work with the King government. We had to really address some of the global challenge we face in the steel sector, and that did not started with President Trump. We like to point out that President Trump sent our world in a tailspin, but it started long before that. The U.S. was actually reacting to global oversupply in the steel sector, and so that was a problem that every national industry is facing. But the U.S. really decided to attack that problem. And unfortunately, we don't, of course, from our point of view, we don't accept or we don't approve the way that they decide to loop everyone in as a problem. So for us, that means that, it was an eye opener. It was time for us to address, the issue we have in our own market.
So, Francois, are you seeing Canadian steel companies? You talked about how much their exports to the United States have dropped. Are you seeing any diversification to different markets aside from the United States? And what's the kind of runway? You can't just snap your fingers and suddenly be selling steel to another country. I mean, you have to have customers in that country. There has to be sales. There needs to be contracts. All sorts of things need to happen. But is that
Yeah.
sort of movement starting?
Unfortunately, our sector, cannot really look at diversification as other sector. We know that other sector that are facing also challenges exporting to the U.S. have turned to other markets and they have been successful. We're happy for that. But in the case of steel, this is not something that's going to happen because, like I was mentioning previously, we're facing global oversupply or overcapacity in the world. So there's too much steel being produced in the world for the demand that we have. So all markets are saturated with steel, which depress price and prevent, someone from competing. And being far from other market, it's difficult for Canadian producers to export to Europe or to Asia and be competitive because of the price
Transportation
transport.
yeah.
And because there's simply too much steel, and we're actually competing, and I don't like saying we're competing, but we have to compete against dump steel. There's a lot of unfair practices in our sector, and it's simply impossible to compete against country like China. China is the main problem of global overcapacity in the steel sector. They have half the capacity, half the production. And just to give you an idea, last year they exported more than 10 times the Canadian production of steel. Well, they're not really exporting, they're dumping their own market.
Yeah.
Right? So it's a problem. So even in our own market, we're seeing a lot of dumping taking place, and it's simply impossible to compete against unfair trade practices. So when it comes to diversification, that's not something that it's possible for us because of this global phenomena. 94% of our exports were going to the US, right? There's a reason for that. And so now for us, if we want to offset our losses from the US market, we have to turn to our own market. 50% of the steel consumed in Canada does not come from Canada, comes from elsewhere. A lot of it, not all, I'm not going to pretend all of it, but a lot of it comes and below market price. Of all the trade remedy users in Canada, steel is by far the largest users. About 75% of all anti-dumping duties apply in Canada today is for either primary forms of steel or steel-containing goods. So there's a lot of dumping happening. So that's why the Canadian government, over the past 8 months, more or less since June of last year, they've been working hard to establish strong border measure to allow our industry to survive, one, from the loss of access to the US, but also to give us better market access in our own market. Because dumping was such a global phenomenon that we had to prevent diversion. Other exporters not having access to US deciding to go export to Canada. We didn't want that to happen, of course. But so we're doing this to this work of pivoting to our own market, which sounds maybe funny for something, but
no, but
we have to do that.
You're raising a good point because I mean, when we talk about diversifying Canadian markets, right? So Canadian exporters that have been caught for steel or anything else, but they're caught sort of in this new environment and this new reality that we're in. When you talk about diversifying your sales, of course that's looking to countries other than the United States internationally. But then we often forget to mention, what about the Canadian market? You can diversify and start looking to sell more within Canada. And that's something that I think it doesn't come to us naturally. Like we just that's it's not our go-to. But I think that's something that business leaders need to adopt that into their head, that this is a viable market. And I'm just going to throw in one statistic that, if you've ever heard me do public speaking before, you've heard me say this before. There are 193 countries that are listed with the United Nations, 195 if you count the Vatican and Palestine. Out of all countries in the United Nations, Canada has the 10th largest economy. We tend to say about ourselves that we're small. Oh, we're small. We're 10% of the size of the United States economy. We're 10% of their population. We're 10%. So we're small. We're tiny. We think that we're tiny. We are small when you compare us to the United States, which is a juggernaut. They're not large. They're 10 times larger than large. So, of course, next to them, Canada looks like a small market. But then if you sort of push the United States aside and look at the rest of the world, 193 countries, and we're 10th. So 183 countries are looking up at us from an economic standpoint. So we have a very good market, and we are not as small as we think we are. So I just wanted to throw that out there because, often when
Your
people say
point,
the
if
Canadian
I can
market is
just
not a big market, well,
to your point, if I can throw another numbers, out of the 192 countries listed at the UN, 105 of them shipped steel to Canada in 2024.
wow.
So that this is what we're facing.
So if I'm hearing you right, I mean, there is opportunity if Canadian business leaders are willing to make the kind of decisions that need to be made to support Canadian industry. If they do that, then there is a potential for our steel industry not only to survive, but hopefully thrive. Because again, the world is bigger than just the US market.
Yeah.
And we need to think of it that way.
Like from our own assessment and from the numbers we have, like it's going to be impossible to totally offset the loss from the US market. But we know we can make up a lot of it. We can sustain our industry and until we resolve the trade situation with the US.
And something that I find interesting, we talked about Europe before. One of the highest forms of flattery is imitation. And recently I was reading that in Europe, the types of tariffs that they've decided to put in on steel, they pretty much looked at what we did in Canada and said, hey, that's actually a pretty good idea. And they kind of copied that logic. And now the same kinds of tariffs, it's not necessarily the same, exact points and all the details, but the concept is the same now in Europe. So
Absolutely.
do you think like that, do other regions adopting those kinds of stances help Canada?
Uh, Many regards, I would say yes. So yes, the EU will have their own TRQ system that they're aiming toward June to implement. The UK released its steel strategy 2 weeks ago, which has similar parameters as our system, and other countries have different approach. Like the Mexican have taken the tariff approach, like the US. So what happens is like, I think we all believe in free trade. We all know it was beneficial to all of us, but we need to realize that, there's some limitation of just having open border for materials, for products, that we need to have, a fair and level playing field among us ourselves if we want to go back to an open door. So my wish is really that because globally we have issue with steel, that a lot of domestic market and different organizations, they're adopting measures to restrict imports of steel to cool off a little bit the steel trade globally. So to clean up the supply chain in their own market, try to stop dumping from occurring, and tackling overcapacity. So once we all done that, nothing will stop us from resuming to trade between ourselves because we have higher standard of trade. We have, level playing field. We're having fair competition, against ourselves. But until we do this cleanup, it's going to be very difficult to resume fair trade because it's going to have an impact on jobs. It's going to have an impact on capacity. And some sector, like the steel sector, is highly important and strategic for your own, national security and your economic development because steel isn't everything. Right?
And you're right, that makes me think of two questions. The first question is, the United States has done what they've done because the purpose that they've stated is that they want to rebuild their own steel industry. They want to block everybody else out so that their own steel industry can grow and thrive. So, I know you're Canadian, but from just a industry perspective, is the United States, do they have enough steel making capacity to actually do what they're trying to do?
The short answer is no. In 2024, the last normal year that we have on record, they imported 26 million tons of steel. They consume 100 million ton, they import 25, they produce, something like 75 to 80 in normal years. So they have to import. So even with a 50% tariff last year, they still imported like 20 million tons steel because they need it. They're not able to scale up and ramp up. Investment in a steel mill takes years and years. You don't build a blast furnace overnight. The
Well,
energy that you
that was
need. So
that was
you can, yeah, so they're gonna need to import for years to come.
that was going to be my next question. Like, in the steel industry in Canada, do you see like Canadian? Because I deal with importers and exporters of all types of commodities, not just steel. And people say to me, are companies, when you talk to Canadian decision makers, senior management of Canadian companies, are they deciding to move to the United States, like move production to the United States to get away from the tariffs? And I'm going to say only a minority of companies are seriously thinking, that I've spoken to, that are seriously thinking about moving to the United States. Investments, and to your point, building a factory, no matter what it is that you're trying to build, you don't do that overnight. And that takes a lot of money. And there's all kinds of other rules and environmental rules, and there's municipal taxes and state taxes, and like, oh yeah, and you actually have to potentially build the actual building if you can't buy one that already exists. Are you seeing Canadian steel companies looking at expanding into the United States to kind of balance their?
No, fair question. A lot of our membership have operation on both sides of the border. Because we were highly integrated.
Mm.
So we had like companies, producing a specific product for, both market or even the three market in North America, and from another facility, doing the same thing with a specific product for all markets, right? So you maximize operation, your efficiency is there, maximize your costs and the whatnot. So it made sense. We were highly integrated. And now we're going back to a little bit of, segregated again, which is unfortunate, I think, because, the real competition comes from the world. It was not between American and Canadian. We were like basically operating as one. So in terms of, investing more, there's clearly a context right now in the US that attracts investment to improve their operation, but it's not really like a move from Canada to the US because the Canadian government has taken measure to make sure that we still have you know, capacity in Canada or still industry because we have
We
politics
need
like
it.
policy like buy Canadian, we have the TRQ. So we're making available, market in Canada for still being made here. So that keeps the incentive to maintain your operation here.
And I mean, it just makes me go back to thinking about what I said on one of the slides. Like, what the Canadian government is doing right now is they're looking for, if you're importing a product into Canada, because people think steel and they think great big rolls of steel or steel bars or whatever. The steel tariffs go beyond that. The surtaxes go beyond that. Articles, the derivatives, things made from steel. So when you look at that, I mean, it's obvious to me now that the priority of the Canadian government is to identify Chinese steel and to, as much as possible, catch it and then tariff it. It's not tariffing. The thinking is not, we're not trying to tariff the finished product that's coming in. It's not that. It's the steel in the product, well, steel or aluminum that's in the product that they're sort of targeting. So, you know, that's the Canadian government priority, I think, because you talked about oversupply and dumping and that kind of stuff. And you're right. I've been in the international trade business now for 40 years. 40 years ago, the majority of dumping cases were steel cases. It's still true today. Like you think anti-dumping, the first thing someone like me thinks about is steel. Anti-dumping equals steel. It's not always the case, but the majority of cases are steel. So that's the Canadian government priority to kind of sort of identify Chinese steel, to push back against that as much as possible because, to your point, that's where the dumping is coming from. But what are the current priorities for the sector? So that's what the government's doing. What are the priorities for the steel sector overall?
Yeah, to circle back a little bit, you were mentioning targeting Chinese steel, but also like the Chinese steel in different product, not just primary form. Um, Most of the measures are targeting like primary steel product. If you look at the different surtax and different tools we have in place, it's really primary steel product. But the way we designed those policy was really to protect Canadian capacity and not create unwanted, hurdles for manufacturing sector. So we recognize that we don't produce all type of steel or steel product in Canada. We went through the exercise of listing over 1,000 product and being able to identify those that we make and don't make in Canada or those that we can potentially make. So out of that list, we came down to a list of about like 600 for which we were like, yeah, we can definitely produce that. So the measure needs to protect that type of steel, not the things we don't make. So not create problem and sector. But the reality is, it's the Chinese, if you block the Chinese on direct steel imports or export to Canada, they're going to go and use third country proxy. So that's why we have a melt and pour surtax on Chinese steel, because they're going to send a Chinese slab to Turkey, they're going to re-roll it into a tube and then send it to Canada. Well, that doesn't make it a Turkish product. It still is Chinese product because they use their overcapacity, their state subsidy to circumvent measures. So we need to target that. But also, you're going to see a lot of steel being used in derivative products. So that's our customer base in the country. So if we protect the primary industry, that's great. But if we don't have customer to sell to, because we're not making garage door anymore in a country, or we're not making cutlery, or we're not, or pipe and tube, like then we're not getting anything. So the Canadian government, when they set up those different policy, was like protect capacity or capabilities we have in the country, try to reduce unwanted consequences for other sectors in the manufacturing world. And I understand it's not perfect, especially working with HS codes, which probably most people online know. We identified capacity at a 10-digit level HS code, which is very, very like precise. But even then, there's some overlap, and unfortunately, we cover things that shouldn't be covered, and that's why we have a remission process to try to avoid those unwanted consequences or correct some of those unwanted consequences.
So you talked about the Canadian steel industry not necessarily being able to make all the kinds of steel that are required in Canada. Are you seeing the industry potentially looking at the different kinds of steel that are not created here today? And is there a thinking that we should start creating different kinds of steel to broaden what we actually make here? Is that happening?
Yeah, absolutely. That was also one of the intent of the government when they transformed the Strategic Innovation Fund into the Strategic Response or Fund. I forgot the new name of the program. To help us
initiative, something.
So they overhauled the program and set aside some funds for the steel industry to contemplate retooling for some product, because like I was mentioning earlier, we basically our industry was highly integrated with the US, so we were like shipping on both sides, but now unfortunately we have to go back to produce what we consume on each other's market, right? So, and with Canadian government's measure to protect the industry and protect the market and allowing some market segment to make a business case for companies to invest in retooling, those questions are being studied attentively by our members.
And just a question that popped into my mind is a lot of that, because this is now additional investment. So this is the Canadian steel industry looking at investing more to diversify the products that they make here in Canada. Is a lot of that uh, investment Canadian born, or do we have other countries that are looking at investing in Canada?
We had some inquiries coming from abroad, I'll be honest. But again, we remain like very, skeptical or,
Yeah.
prudent when it comes to investment because, our industry requires a lot of CapEx. It's really CapEx
Yeah.
intensive. It costs a lot. Again, like I mentioned, you don't build a blast furnace overnight. It's billions of dollars. It's an asset you intend to use for 60 years, 70 years. So,
And how long does it take to build a blast furnace? Just like ballpark to give people like I know it's not months. Is it years?
well, it's years because if you think of like really like the infrastructure needed for it, like the industry, the energy needed to run
Mhm.
one. So you need to secure those, the asset, the energy, and the infrastructure to come with. So it's several years. So very several years. So yes, we had interest shown by other countries, but when it comes to create new capacity, it's like you cannot just build a new facility, a new mill when you're in a context that you don't have enough work for your own mills, right?
Mhm. Does the steel, like for you as the association for the steel producers in Canada, is there any sort of looking to the left and to the right? So, for example, is there any kind of coordination with, for example, automotive parts manufacturers or automotive manufacturers who obviously they're users of steel? They're not the only ones, but they're big users of steel. Is there cooperation in Canada, meaning looking left and looking right to make
Yeah,
sure everybody is
I,
trying
yeah,
to
at
do
the
the right thing for
association level,
Canada?
we have a lot of horizontal collaboration. We have a good relationship with the automotive sector because, of course, it's 30% of our market,
Mhm.
our customer. So we have, roughly speaking, like three main customers for industry. We have the construction industry, we
Yeah.
have the energy industry, talk pipe and tube in the oil and gas sector, but also when we talk about wind towers and solar panel, but also the automotive sector is also so they split more or less like in terms of one third each of our market. So of course we we have them close. They're friends.
So, the 800-pound gorilla in the room is uh, the renewal of the USMCA or CUSMA, as we call it in Canada, that's supposed to be happening around July 1st. I was recently at a luncheon where Canada's chief negotiator, Janice Charest, was one of the key speakers. And the first point that she made is that what's happening in early July with the US and Mexico is not supposed to be a renegotiation, it's supposed to be a renewal,
Correct.
right? So which, I know the Canadians are going to try as much as possible not to renegotiate things. But what are your thoughts about what's happening? What do you hope to see in the renewal or a changed CUSMA? Like,
Right.
what are you thinking?
Like we certainly want to see the agreement be extended. Of course, I believe again that it was beneficial even in NAFTA years and
Mhm.
before that when we had a bilat with the US, I think it was beneficial for everyone. And the last one, USMCA CUSMA, was also beneficial to all three partners. And so we really wanted it to be extended. But of course, from our point of view, is we already had a free trade deal with the US, and nonetheless, they slapped tariffs on us, which we think were unjustified and not respective of the deal we had. So for us, we certainly want to see CUSMA renew, but we definitely want to see the Section 232 tariffs being addressed and solved within those negotiations taking place or review. We know that it's a novelty to have a review and a free trade deal. So I'm not sure that everyone is very certain what
Yeah.
it entails, but certainly I think that the case for the renewal of this deal is it's obvious to a lot of players, but we cannot sign for cheap. We definitely need to have also a solution for 232s, because again, like The US slapped tariffs on us. We slapped tariff back on them in retaliation. But the US industry was shipping a lot of steel to Canada annually. 40% of Canadian imports of steel comes from the US. So they also lost on that, right? And
Yeah.
a lot of the primary or the input we use, the raw material we use to make steel comes from the US. We still sell product to the US. They transform into a car that they sell back to Canada. So there was a lot of benefit for everyone. And so we think that this deal should be renewed. It's going to be rocky, that's for sure. It's going to be complicated. We might not get it signed on July 1st,
Yeah.
but I remain optimistic, although it's going to be complicated. It's going to be rough, but definitely our point of view is 232s, not just for us, but other sectors should be addressed in the global context of this review.
And if I remember correctly, under CUSMA, there were side letters that were signed. So you have the main deal, that the main trade agreement, and then there were side letters that were signed, some of them for automotive and some of them for steel, steel and aluminum. And these tariffs just basically ignored the fact that those side letters existed, because if I remember correctly, those side letters basically said the United States will not charge tariffs on Canada until a 90-day negotiation period
Right.
has happened. And that none of that happened, right? The side letter, it's like it didn't even exist, and the tariffs
That
moved
was
on.
contrary to the spirit of CUSMA. We have to understand that side letter between Canada and the US on steel were removing the previous tariffs were imposed on us.
Mhm.
And tariffs were removed because we implemented what was decided, which was like to implement a melt and pour monitoring system and have anti-circumvention legislation adopted by Canada, which those two were signed by Canada and implemented by Canada. But also, it should be noted that the North American steel industry, whether it's Mexican, American, and Canadian, we are closely aligned in terms of what should be done to protect the North American space for the steel market, in terms of what should be trade remedy tools at our disposal, in terms of calibration on different aspect of compliance and protection of our market. So I think that there's definitely room for all our industry to agree on what should be implemented within CUSMA to make the steel sector in North America more competitive and more able to fend off those unfair trade practices in our space.
Yeah, in listening to comments that the US Trade Representative Jameson Greer in the United States, he's the equivalent to the Canadian chief negotiator, is Jameson Greer, excuse me. In recent comments that he made, he was speaking somewhere publicly recently, and he also testified before Congress at the end of December. His comments overall about the free trade agreement were that there's definite benefit to CUSMA, or USMCA as they call it. There's benefits, but there are differences between the Canadian economy and the Mexican economy, and that it might be a better thing for the United States to have, instead of a trilateral deal, two bilaterals. Now, that seems to have changed a little bit in the past couple of weeks when you hear him talk. It's not so much now that he's looking at completely doing away with the existing trade agreement. He talked about having pillars, weight-bearing pillars of the free trade agreement that should stay in place. So I'm thinking a lot of that is probably rules of origin. And because this administration has not sought authority from Congress to renegotiate a free trade agreement, there's very little that they can actually change because they don't have authority from Congress to change it. So I think what's potentially going to happen is a whole bunch of side letters, tweaking with the various things when all three parties agreed to tweaking various rules of origin or whatever that were maybe had unintended consequences, or we all agree they're problematic for some reason. But then you're going to have, I think, a series of side letters, which is great. But side letters, so they didn't work really last time. So,
Yeah, no, but to your point, I think it would be easier for everyone to keep a trilateral agreement in place. We are highly integrated. We
yeah,
understand that the challenge that the US has with Mexico is different than what they have with Canada. But I think that 30 years of integration and a single market cannot overnight be replaced by bilateral, and that would mean also having Canada and Mexico having their bilateral deal. So it will make it highly complicated. But I would just say that Ambassador Greer also testified in Congress that this recommendation to the president would be to maintain USMCA as a two-party deal. And he said that if all parties agrees to modify some of their policy and regulation and legislation in place.
Yeah, I agree. But he did make those comments, that there's a lot of benefits to the USMCA, and the USMCA has many pillars, load-bearing pillars, as he described it. So that's actually good news to my ears, where hopefully a good chunk of the agreement is actually kept. So we've got 5 minutes left. I'm just going to check to see if we've got any questions. Are there any questions from the audience? There are no questions at this point. If you've got any questions, just please type them in the chat area, the question and answer area of the software. So, I mean, ultimately, we are headed for, I think, a summer and a fall, because you said earlier, and I agree with you, that I don't know that all the negotiations between the US, Canada, and Mexico will not be finalized and in place by July 1st. I don't think that that's even reasonable. The Canadians haven't even really been engaging with Washington for months, so I don't think it's feasible. But is there anything specific that you would want to see for the steel industry, or would you want the existing rules to stay in place? Or are there changes that are required?
Yeah, as much as in terms of our own priority as a sector, like we definitely want like all the package, all the measures that the Canadian government has put in place in recent months for us. We want that to keep going and be in place and extended for those that are time limited. So we definitely need that because we cannot have the reassurance that the US market will ever reopen to us. We have no certainty of CUSMA being reviewed and signed. So we definitely need to have our protection in our own market. Even if the US market reopen, I can guarantee that a lot of our members do not trust this administration and are fearful that anytime that they can have a tariff been put back on them. So first and foremost, maintain what we gained over the past year in terms of protecting our market. And then for USMCA, of course, like strict minimum, if nothing's changed, we're going to be fine. Keep it as is. But we can also work on rules of origin. We can improve when it comes to monitoring of imports with a melt and pour system. Mexican, they don't have yet a system like Canada and the US have. We can talk about, having a common border measure with all our partners saying, well, if it's not melt and pour in North America, well, you face either a TRQ or quota or tariff. But that between ourselves, we're going to have, free trade on steel. So there's different mechanism we can explore, and we think that we can even like improve what we got from the last time. But if we have to satisfy ourselves with the current deal, as long as 232 is addressed, we're going to be fine with that.
So we've got a question from the audience. Are there any specific regions of steel production in Canada that have been more particularly hit by the impact of the US tariffs than others?
Well, of course, 65% of the steel production in Canada is in Ontario. So definitely Ontario has been hit hard more than others. But we have 5 provinces where we produce steel from Alberta all the way to Quebec and everything in between. But really, like Ontario, 65-70% of the steel production. So that's where like the pressure is mostly felt.
So there's another question here, and I'm not sure I fully understand the question. What is the government of Canada, I think, doing? There's some words missing here. Doing to stop dumping based on your discussion, because this is not healthy for the local market. So I'll just jump in there to say dumping duties are put in place by governments to stop foreign countries from sending goods to our country, to Canada, at artificially low prices, right?
Yeah.
So that's unfair competition. So that's why dumping duties are in place. So will the Canadian government take their foot off the gas on dumping duties anytime soon? Francois, I'll let you answer that, but my answer is like no.
The trade release system remains one of the first line of defense that we have. We're taking cases or members or bringing unfair traders to the Canadian International Trade Tribunal. So that remains in place. Our system is good. It's not perfect, but we always say that we're only second to the U.S. trade remedy system. So we have a good system that needs to be improved, but it's there. Then we have all the other measures. When it comes to TRQ, having this tier approach, like non-FTAs and FTAs, that also, because we know that non-FTAs are the worst offenders most of the time. Then we have special attention and special measure on China because it's the mother of all dumping is China.
Yeah.
So a specific measure on China. Are we going to stop all dumping? No, because cheat or cheat. It's a whack-a-mole game. You catch them somewhere, they're going to pop up elsewhere. But we need to be vigilant. We need to modernize our tool. And, this is, it's unfortunately the situation we have, but we're in a better space now than we were, let's say, 8 months ago.
And I guess the only other thing that I would add there, so if the person who asked that question is a manufacturer and you're being hurt right now by steel tariffs dumping and that sort of thing, what I can say is if the type of steel that you're purchasing is really not available in the Canadian marketplace and you're being hit hard by tariffs, the Department of Finance has a remission program. You can approach the Department of Finance and make your case, and potentially you could get relief. Your specific company could get relief. I say that, but you can't go to finance and say it's a financial stressor on us to pay the tariffs. Well, can you buy the steel in Canada? Yeah, but it's cheaper to buy someplace else. Well, then you're not going to get the remission, right?
Yeah,
So
no, right. Well, a couple of things. First of all, the way we design those tools and those measures, we don't target things we don't make. So if you're certain that the still are the products you're making that cannot be sourced in Canada, and not based on price, like you mentioned, but something that you simply cannot source in Canada, it shouldn't be restricted from imports. It should be targeted by any measure. There's some overlaps in the HS code, so that could happen potentially.
something
But you have the
accidental cost,
remission
that's
in
different.
us, yeah, and us as an association and an industry, we're not blocking or recommending the government from granting remission on the goods we don't make.
Well, we're at time, and Francois, I want to thank you very much for joining us here today for an important conversation, very timely as well, given last Friday's announcement in the United States of the new rules for steel and aluminum. And as we discussed, the renewal, not renegotiation, for CUSMA is coming sometime this summer. So with that, I thank you very much for joining us today. And at some point in the future, if something dramatic happens in the steel and aluminum, the steel industry, I will be definitely thinking to invite you back for another webinar. You are a wealth of knowledge, and I thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone, have a good one, and we'll catch you on the next CILTNA webinar.